The Switch 2 is here, and many of us are scouring the internet to get our hands on the latest handheld. Those who got one, congratulations, I'm insanely jealous. The rest of us are looking at our now last-gen console wondering if we can upgrade before Nintendo pulls the plug. Previously, I ran down the timeline of Nintendo home console releases in order to get a better understanding of how they may treat the transition to their latest creation. However, that was only half the story. After all, part of the appeal of both the Switch and Switch 2 is its ability to fully commandeer a rooftop party. And unlike the battles of the home console market, Nintendo has maintained a white-knuckle grip on the handheld industry. Quick note before we begin, we will be starting with the Game Boy. One could argue that the Game & Watch was Nintendo's first handheld, but we chose to focus on cartridge-swappable systems for this video. Are there any new insights we can receive from this corner of the market? Let's take a trip down memory lane to find out. Look, Nintendo knocked it out of the park with their first big entry in the handheld market, the Nintendo Game Boy. Released in 1989, it saw 9 years of market dominance before being succeeded by the Game Boy Color in late 1998. Even then, it really felt more like a mid-generation update than a succession. Like the Switch OLED compared to the original Switch, and Nintendo even produced the revised Game Boy Pocket and Japan-only Game Boy Light well into the Color's early years. The green screen Game Boy still saw new releases after the Game Boy Color, partially because the Game Boy Color was backwards compatible, and some of the Game Boy Color games could be played on the OG hardware. Mario's Picross 2 was the last first-party game released as a proper Game Boy title, over a year after the Game Boy Color was released, although many games continued to hold the dual mode label, meaning they would work on both handheld systems. Furthermore, despite the technical differences, many games had both Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance versions, since publishers didn't want to leave the many Game Boy Color players in the lurch. The final Game Boy Color games were Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets in the West in 2002, and a Doraemon educational game in Japan in 2003, about a year or so after the release of the Game Boy Advance. Nintendo would completely discontinue the Game Boy Color later that year, marking 14 years of 8-bit glory. For how popular this system was, it's easy to forget that 2001's Game Boy Advance was succeeded by the DS just over 3 years later in 2004, although it remained a staple of the Nintendo lineup until the final shipments to North America in 2010, overlapping with its successor for much longer than most other systems. As a matter of fact, Nintendo considered the DS more of a third pillar of their brand until sales started to decline for the GBA around 2006. In that time, it saw the release of the clamshell GBA SP and the Micro, as well as some major first-party releases post-DS, The Legend of Zelda: The Minish Cap and Pokémon Emerald, both in 2005. This was helped by the DS's backwards compatibility with Game Boy Advance games. Much like we've seen with previous generations, third-party developers were also hesitant to give up on the system, the last third-party release being Samurai Deeper Kyo, released February in 2008. Nintendo kinda hedged their bets with the DS. Their strategy releasing it as a third pillar made the handoff between the GBA and the new system their smoothest to date. So much so that since its 2004 release, it became their best-selling console, with over 150 million units sold and the second best-selling console of all time after the PS2. It wasn't until 7 years later that Nintendo attempted to follow this up with the 3DS in March 2011. As with the Game Boy Advance and Game Boy before it, its massive success led to multiple models hitting shelves: DS Lite, DSi, and DSi XL. These revisions remained in the market longer than the original, as the DS was replaced by the DS Lite in 2006. The Lite was then discontinued in 2012, and the DSi series ended in 2014. As per usual, first-party support ended relatively quickly. Nintendo seems to want its user base to move on as fast as possible, although 150 million units is hard to ignore. Pokémon Black and White version 2 were released in 2012 intentionally to leverage the DS users while they get the 3DS into more hands. After that, most users were only seeing movie and TV tie-ins on the system, with Big Hero 6 Battle in the Bay being the final game to hit the market in 2014, around the same time Nintendo shut down the system's Wi-Fi connection service. The last remaining vestiges of support were removed in 2017, when Nintendo closed the DSi digital storefront. The Nintendo 3DS was both literally and figuratively a hard sell for consumers. After its release in 2011, it did not see the same initial adoption as the original DS. The launch library was thin, the price was the highest Nintendo had seen for a handheld to that point, and the integrated 3D felt more like an obnoxious fad than the next step in technology, leading to a slow start for the system. It was fully backwards compatible with DS games and saw some impressive graphics for its size, but it wasn't until they dropped the price and started offering newer models like the easier to hold 3DS XL and the easier to look at 2DS that the system began to pick up steam. When the Switch launched in 2017, Nintendo attempted to convince the public that it was not the 3DS's successor, releasing the 2DS XL in mid-2017, courting the more budget-friendly audience. Nintendo even promised to support the system through 2018, releasing first-party titles like Pokémon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, Detective Pikachu, and the final first-party release in early 2019, Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story plus Bowser Jr.'s Journey. There were a few 2020 digital-only releases, but nothing of note. The Switch Lite's release in 2019 finally supplanted the 3DS's place in Nintendo's court as the new entry-level experience. This is still not the entire story, however. With no backwards compatibility for the handheld offering, Nintendo felt pressure to maintain online services for the older handheld well past its life. The 3DS had a bevy of beloved online features, each slowly being removed as we entered the current age. In 2018, Nintendo removed smaller features like the Street Pass relay system. But it wasn't until March 27, 2023 that Nintendo took action and shut down the 3DS eShop, much to the chagrin of gamers worldwide. In April 2024, Nintendo ended online play and network services for good across all previous home and handheld consoles, a final nail in the coffin after a generous 12-year life cycle. This was truly a new era of Nintendo. Who knows what the future holds now that the Switch 2 has been released? Heck, if I did, I probably wouldn't have made this video. Nintendo aren't fools. They know that the Switch was an amazing success, and some have argued that they've held off on the Switch 2 release due to the success of the original system. I believe we can expect a longer tail, similar to the Wii or the DS, and are already kind of starting to see that. Nintendo has announced that the Switch 2 will mostly be compatible with both physical and digital titles, including the ability to transfer your downloaded games, save data, and settings to the new device. Nintendo will also be releasing Switch 2 Edition upgrades for games like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, allowing for faster load times, higher frame rates, and in some circumstances like Mario Party Jamboree, brand new game modes. These are all obviously benefits for the Switch 2, but that leads me to believe that it will be much easier to release a game for both systems. Company president Shuntaro Furukawa even stated that Nintendo will continue to support the original Nintendo Switch as long as there was demand for it. Taken at face value, that's pretty promising to hear. What's more worthy of note, the Switch was often a vehicle for giving indie titles a second life on the go. And much like other Nintendo systems with a huge user base, I imagine third-party developers will not want to drop the potential 150 million Switch users for the smaller starting base of the newly released Switch 2. Many indie and non-AAA titles weren't incredibly demanding on the Switch, so as long as the online services are on, I think we have a good while before your favorite cozy pixel art slice of life sim is no longer available for both devices. In the end, it truly depends on the success of the Switch 2. Both the DS and the Wii saw long life cycles, partially because their successors were slow to, or in the case of the Wii U, never did, connect with the larger gaming community. The lack of supply compared to the high demand has made availability elusive for some, but you can't ignore some of the initial hiccups we've already seen. Fans have been vocal about the price of both the system and some of its major releases, and outside of a few first-party titles, it's been a lot of re-releases or remasters from other platforms. The hardcore gamers who really wanted to play Elden Ring or Cyberpunk 2077 weren't waiting for the Switch 2 release to get their fix. The Switch 2 certainly seems to be a technological leap, but more of a Wii to Wii U leap than a Super Nintendo to N64 leap. It's hard to say, but given the immense popularity of the Switch in its lifetime, I'm feeling particularly optimistic. I don't think I can give you a date for when the end will be, but Nintendo will want to wait until the Switch 2 feels like a success before kicking original users to the curb. If it's taken too long, maybe they'll drop the system's price like they did with the 3DS. If they drop a new generation variant like the Switch did with the Switch Lite, then that could replace the original Switch as an entry-level option, possibly ending the manufacturing on the system for good. Even then, expect third-party support to continue and digital services to remain as long as there are still Animal Crossing islands to visit. Plus, I've not seen confirmation of Baby Park and Mario Kart World yet, so I really don't have a reason to leave 8 Deluxe behind. What do you think? Will history repeat itself, or are we in unprecedented times when it comes to supporting last-gen hardware? Let's get your hottest take in the comments below, and for all the latest updates, releases, and look-backs in gaming, stay tuned to Game Rant.